Hi there, everybody, and welcome to Boomer Time. I'm your host, Nancy Cogar, and I'm glad you're here. You know, I've been watching this news story and the fallout of the authorities finding actor Gene Hackman and his wife in their New Mexico home. And you know what? The more it's unpacked, the more it's brought so many of the issues we talk about here on Boomer Time out into the national lens. And that's everything from when it comes to aging, end of life care, staying at home, keeping your older loved ones safe, everything to estate planning. As I always say, these are the issues that affect all of us. And the key is planning, right? Personalized planning. So it looks like Gene Hackman could have used some additional planning when it came to his estate plan, believe it or not. We're still learning about the circumstances involving his death. But I wanted to talk about the estate planning piece before we dive into today's larger issue. So obviously, you would expect that Gene Hackman's estate would be significant, right? Well, we're getting word now that he left an estate valued at about $80 million. That includes that sprawling $4 million estate in New Mexico that we've seen on television. You know what? But it appears that Gene Hackman made a will with an attorney in Texas at some point. It's unclear whether it was ever updated. It did not have many contingent provisions in it, from what I've heard. And that's the if this, then this. In fact, it appears that Gene Hackman left his entire estate to his wife. Well, of course, his wife is also deceased, right? And there was a trust, and his wife was named successor trustee at his death. Well, what about the circumstances since they both passed? That's not clear, but there are a couple big red flags for me. The last time Gene Hackman updated his will was in 2005. That's 20 years prior. It's unclear whether he left anything to his three children, who were from his first wife. His second wife, Betsy, she did have contingent provision in her estate, and it provides for an alternate distribution to a list of charities at her death. So, really, this would just appear to be ripe for challenges in court between the blended family, right? I've talked about that before. Natural children not included in Hackman's documents, and the lapse of time, the 20 years from the estate planning. And, of course, not to mention the significant amount of money. Stay tuned, okay? We're going to talk more about real life issues as you try to live independently and stay at home. Well, welcome back to Boomer Time. We are talking about the issues that come up in those sunset years. And what can you do to protect yourself if you're wanting to remain at home? Or alternatively, if you're caring for an older adult. Both of these are significant. We are looking at the recent deaths of Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy, right? Gene Hackman was 95 years old. His wife was 65. You would think something like this wouldn't happen to people as with as many resources as that, but of course, we don't know all the details yet surrounding their death. But we did get an important glimpse into their lifestyle there in that New Mexico house. And although Gene Hackman had a $80 million estate, he had a handyman and some local contacts. For the most part, they were really relying on one another and just otherwise alone in that sprawling house. In Hackman's case, there are reports that he and his wife lived really in solitude towards their later years, which to me begs the question, what happens when elderly individuals live alone, isolated from their family and community? And more importantly, what legal risks come with that type of isolation? These are important questions. And this is what I wanted to talk about. And it's that isolation that can often come from the decision to remain at home in your later years. Now, I'm not saying don't do it. I just want to offer some suggestions today that I hope will maybe put better support in place if you choose to remain at home and age in place, as the terminology goes. And, I also want to offer some counsel about how to protect yourself from some of these things that come up as well. First, I wanted to start with some of the challenges of living alone and a legal perspective on elder isolation. So, as an elder law attorney, I deal with these kinds of questions all the time. When an elderly person lives alone, especially in isolation or by themselves, right? There are several significant legal issues that can come up. These range from everything from matters of guardianship, conservatorships, financial management, even to potential elder abuse and estate disputes. Many of these relate back to prior episodes of Boomer Time where I get into these issues on a deeper level. So I encourage you to go back and look at some of those issues. We'll try to reference some of those for you too. But right now, let's break down some of the most common issues. So if an elderly person becomes mentally or physically incapacitated and unable to make decisions for themselves, family members or third parties may need to step in. This could lead to what we call a conservatorship here in Tennessee. And we just talked about that process in a 2-part podcast. This is a complex issue, and I encourage you to go back and listen to that. But unfortunately, isolation, often makes elderly individuals vulnerable to abuse, whether that's physical or financial. There have been many cases where older adults who live alone fall victim to physical abuse, often by, believe it or not, caregivers or even family members. There's also financial exploitation, which could come in the form of fraud, manipulation, or just plain old unauthorized access to an elderly person's bank accounts and other estates. If you've been around for a while, you know that I try to keep up to date on all these scams. There are a lot of them out there. And you can go to my website too, nancycogar.com, if you want to find more information on those. I try to share some of those stories with you, cases where seniors have been scammed right here in Chattanooga. I just learned of another, and these scammers are so brazen. This one involves a woman who lives by herself in Harrison. She's owned her own home and lived on her own for decades. She's alone now. Someone called her on her home line and informed her that she owed $30,000 in back taxes, and she needed to satisfy that debt immediately or face losing her house and her family land. Does that sound convincing to you? Well, she fell for it and went down to the bank and got a cashier's check, which is just like cash, my friends, for $30,000. And you know what that scammer, bill collector, scam artist had the audacity to do? He came to her house and picked up the check. Yep. These are the issues that come out of this isolation. And it's so pervasive that the AARP is now advocating for legislation known as the Loneliness and Isolation Act. They want to look at this as a public health issue. That sounds complex to me to address it in a meaningful way at national level. But I do think that there are some things we can do, locally at a grassroots level, even as a family or a good neighbor. And it's important to have regular communication with your older family members. That can go a long way. In addition to communication, here are a few very practical steps you can take. You've heard this one from me too. Estate planning Where have you heard this before, right? Make sure you have very specific, clear, and updated estate planning in place. This includes a valid will, maybe a trust, and powers of attorney, end of life directives for both medical care and financial care. And it must be updated. Remember what I said about Gene Hackman, right? His was nearly 20 years old, 95, $80 million estate. I can help you with this. Believe me, having these will ensure that your directives, your directions are followed, and they really can prevent costly legal battles over these issues. Another important tactic is regular check-ins. Okay, I've already mentioned the communication aspect, but if you have an elderly relative who is living alone, regular check-ins are critical. I heard about a lady that fell on the floor. She was all alone. She didn't have an alert, anything. She was on the floor for several days. Okay, these can come in many forms as far as check-ins. You could daily calls, visits. You can even arrange for home care services. The more involved you are in their life, the better chance you have of preventing abuse or neglect and ensuring that they are remaining mentally and physically well. It just makes sense, right? This is common sense, but we're all so busy, sometimes we forget. Also, have the right legal counsel in place. I cannot overemphasize how important it is to have an ongoing relationship with an elder law attorney. This will help prevent many of the issues I've already mentioned here. Physical risks of living alone, increased risk of falls, chronic health conditions, and even medication management. I've mentioned this on other podcasts, but did you know that falls are the number one reason that folks end up in the hospital and sometimes in the nursing home and are unable to return home? Social isolation is a significant factor in the rise of mental health problems in older adults. That makes sense too. You're alone, right? Conditions like depression, dementia, anxiety, these are all more common among those who live alone. So, when mental health declines, your decision making capacity can also go down, and that complicates things. If you don't have the right planning in place, you could be looking to the court for intervention. So, on that note, here's another story I wanted to bring to you as the potential weight of isolation. I think these examples that I share, really do help with a better understanding of these complex legal issues. So here's Henry's story. Henry, had always been a quiet man, a loner, really kept to himself. He never married, and his siblings, they all passed away years ago. Red flag, red flag. He needs estate planning. I've seen this before. So Henry's in his 90s and he lives alone in a small apartment. Over time, those phone calls become less frequent and visits from extended family dwindle because life just gets busier. While Henry had always preferred solitude, he started to feel the weight of the isolation more than ever. He hadn't left his apartment in over a week when he started feeling lightheaded and dizzy. Henry hadn't been eating regularly. He was mostly relying on cans of soup. And one day, his neighbor, a young woman named Ella, knocked on his door to check on him. She noticed his thin frame and the mess around the apartment, and Henry reluctantly admitted to Ella that he was struggling. She offered to help. She brought him meals, she did grocery runs for him, and she even checked in on him daily. Eventually, she convinced him to visit a doctor, and it turned out that he was so severely dehydrated and had malnutrition All that was contributing to his dizziness and his depression. So, with Ella's support, Henry started to regain his strength and, his outlook on life changed. He learned that it wasn't a sign of weakness to rely on others, and slowly he began to connect with his community again, accepting the support that he had really long resisted. I like this because it's a happy ending from a good Samaritan neighbor, you know. I emphasize the importance of community here on Boomer Time. We are going to take another short break now, and when I come back, I have a few more thoughts and challenges on living alone in your later years and building a better defense and support for that chosen lifestyle. I'll be back. Welcome back to Boomer Time. So, as I promised, I've got some suggestions for you to put a better plan in place for all you older adults living at home, or those of you caring for an older adult that wants to continue to live at home. Certainly, as I said, more frequent communication and having a comprehensive estate plan, right, are critical, as I've already mentioned, and we'll keep mentioning. So let's talk about a few things that can be done proactively to the house itself. There's some very practical things you can do to modify the home to make it more accessible. And, it's the obvious things: grab bars, you can put in a walk in shower rather than a tub. You can help with travel upstairs and downstairs to prevent falls. You put ramps in, make sure all those pathways are clear. You know, Also, medical alert systems for emergency situations really can make a difference. I know sometimes people are reluctant to wear those, just like hearing aids, but it makes a big difference. And if you do fall, you have the ability to let someone know and have someone come help you. There are also health monitoring devices, just like the smartwatches now. They can track sleep, heart rates, and even falls. Simple thing. A routine, of regular check ins, phone calls, Zoom calls, I've already mentioned that. And, encourage your loved ones to engage in some of the local community activities with like minded seniors. I've seen a lot of people that were reluctant to do that, but then they really loved it afterwards and met all kinds of new people, played bridge, you know, talked about things they're all interested in, even volunteer work. If they're able to do that, there's a great team of older volunteers down at the hospitals here in town. Also, like I said, you want to look into better transportation options. Sometimes driving is an issue, but there's rideshare, there's Uber, there's all kinds of things you can do. Just another way to help keep them safe and help with being out and about, right? Well, the question of whether it is illegal to leave an elderly person alone touches on a broader kind of societal and legal responsibility concerning elder care. You know, as I've said, populations are aging and the issue becomes increasingly more relevant, highlighting the need for clear guidelines and protections for these vulnerable adults. The legal framework surrounding elder care is complex, and it varies by state. In the United States, federal laws like the Older Americans Act provide for a foundation of elder care, emphasizing services that try to uphold the dignity and welfare of older adults. But there's some state laws that primarily dictate caregiver obligations to ensure the safety and well being of elder individuals. So I want to circle back with this issue some issues related to, abuse, exploitation. All of this is very complex. So I want to focus on that, I think, in a future podcast more specifically. because it is just that complex. So here's something else you can do. It's simple and proactive. You know what it is? Follow this podcast so you never miss an episode. And share it with a friend, would you? I always like to see those numbers growing out there. And if you connect with me, which I hope you do, suggest a topic for the episode. If you have a question, I want to hear from you. And you can find me on YouTube, Spotify, and my website, nancycogar.com. So come on, join the Boomer Time community. And we're even on Facebook. That's what Boomer Time is all about. I'm sharing some of my expertise with the hopes of making your older years better and more prepared. We're seeing more and more conversations surrounding elder isolation, and we need to address these things head on. The U.S. Census Bureau, that tracks population, says the number of Americans age 65 and older is going to double from 49 million, which was in 2016, to 95 million by 2060. Now's the time, okay? If you do not have a plan in place, or if you have an elderly loved one, don't wait. Please start the conversation today about estate planning. Plan those regular check-ins and ensuring that they're all legally protected. Reach out to me and schedule a strategy session. We will sit down and figure all of this out together. So for now, I will see you next time here on Boomer Time.